Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Creative Human Experiences in Conversation. Today we are with Vincent Blok, and I would like to welcome Vincent and thank you very much for joining in this conversation today.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. And for our listeners, I would like to introduce Vincent Blok. He's a Dutch philosopher working as a professor in philosophy at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He received his PhD in philosophy at Leiden University in 2005 with a specialization in philosophy of technology. And from 2006 to 2010, he was the CEO of an international research institute in the field of sustainable agriculture, nutrition, and healthcare. Vincent is deeply interested in the meaning of disruptive technologies for the human condition and its environment, and he approaches these questions from a continental philosophical perspective. His books includes Ernst Junger Philosophies of Technology, Heidegger and the Poetics of the Anthropocene, Heidegger's Concept of Philosophical Method, The Critique of Management towards a Philosophy of Ethic of Business Management, just to cite, to mention some of them, and in a very extensive publication list. At Creative Human Experiences, we are opening a space to reflect on time, creation, and creative human experiences. And one of the threads in this space is the idea that time itself can be understood as a creative, ontologically generative dimension, rather than just a neutral background. Today, I would like to bring your work, Vincent, on the ontology of innovation and creation, especially your idea that innovation participates in the making of worlds into dialogue with these questions. So maybe we can start with your central idea about innovation and work. And so in your work, you argue, Vincent, that innovations like the steam engine or the artificial intelligence are not simply new tools or products. They actually participate in the creations of new worlds in which humans and non-humans find their place. Can you explain this distinction between, on the one hand, concrete innovations at the level of artifacts, and on the other, the broader ontological level of work that they help to bring forth?
Yeah. So, so thanks again for the invitation, and very nice to be able to talk about these, in my view, very important topics. So maybe we can start with a simple example, like the dominance today of AI technologies in our society. And you can ask yourself the question, on what level of our society does AI or digital technologies have an impact? And if you, for instance, look at ChatGPT as a technology, for instance, you can raise all kinds of questions about the technology. For instance, what is the ownership of the data concerning the data that is used to train the models? Or is there not a possibility of manipulation? And these are all relevant questions that are focusing on the technology itself, the artifact. And that is what we normally understood as technology. Things in the world, machines, and in this case, digital machines and automated machines. But if you look at the societal concerns that are raised by AI and digital technologies, they seem to be broader than just a concern about the technology. Because, for instance, humans have the experience or have the concern or the intuition that they become instrumentalized. The commodification of data, the instrumentalization of life, and notions like surveillance. I'm sure that you are aware of surveillance capitalism. So there seems to be a sort of connection or disconnect between how we normally talk about technologies as artifacts and how they are experienced if we are concerned. And this is why I think it is important to talk about various levels in which, for instance, technologies have an impact, and why you can say AI technologies, for instance, or digital technologies have an impact or disrupt the world in which we live and act. And to give an example of this, we all have our everyday life, for instance, in which we see each other in front of a camera, and then we have the experience that we talk with a human. And at the same time, in the digital era or in the digital time or the time of AI, it is not necessarily a human that is sitting in front of me like Antonio, but it is a data set. It is the product of calculation. Your background, for instance, is just a picture. So there is something which changes in our experience, also our experience of daily life, that has nothing to do with you and me as individual persons, but have to do with what is the meaning or what is the context in which we encounter each other. And philosophers are especially interested in these type of changes that have nothing to do with you and me, but with the context or the world, as another way to frame this, the world that changes based on the disruption, or that is disrupted by digital technologies in this example.
See, I see your point. In a practical level, how you will let's say put an example of this context changes that bring forth due to the technology, to the technological innovation.
Yeah, an example that I really like is, for instance, in Europe, we invest in the development of a digital twin of planet Earth. This project is called Destiny, and it's meant to model and predict, for instance, the impact of climate interventions. On one hand, if we have a digital copy of the planet, we can calculate and model what will be the impact of climate change on future policies, for instance, or in the future, so that you can also make policies based on the calculations. And you can also think of what will be the effect of interventions, policy interventions that we develop. And we can test them then in a digital environment. And if it works, we can implement them in the real world environment. This is an example of a digital technology, and many of my colleagues will be very happy with that. And for instance, because we are concerned with climate change. And that is also a very good way to do things. And at the same time, I am interested in what is actually the relation between the virtual world that is emerging and the physical world that I'm living on. In a way, we have to assume a continuity between the physical world and the digital world, because if there's no continuity, then any prediction based on our calculations in the digital world will not have an effect on the real world. And that's, of course, what we want to prevent. And at the same time, there are many differences between the physical world and the digital world. And that is the entry point then for critical questions, but also more these type of ontological questions that I just indicated a moment ago.
Yeah, this actually brings me to the connection with the perspective of the ontology of innovation and time itself. And from your point of view, how that's this ontology of creation, where innovation is seen as work making rather than just a problem solving. And if you would like to also make perhaps some this distinction, help us to rethink what innovation is from beyond the purely technical and economic perspective.
Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that as a philosopher of technology, we tend to talk about technology. And technology is, in first instance, again, seen as an artifact that you encounter in the world, like the digital twin that I mentioned, like ChatGPT. And at the same time, the interesting change of perspective, if we use innovation, is to introduce this temporal dimension. Because innovation is not only an end product. So innovation can be seen as a product, the first steam engine, the first AI generated chatbot, the first digital twin. That's the outcome of an innovation process. But innovation has also this dimension, this verbal meaning of a process leading to this outcome. And by introducing innovation rather than technology, we can provide more sophisticated attention to the process of emergence, because it turns out that technology is not falling from heaven, but it's indeed a long evolutionary process that is a temporal process, and we can think of it in terms of an evolution, a technological or an evolution of invention. There are good reasons to think about. So that is the first reason why I'm interested in innovation and not only in technology, so to speak. Also, content-wise, you can say every technology is the product of innovation, but it's not the case that all innovations lead to new technologies. And just as a sidestep, what is for me very important is that if you look at the history of innovation, so the history of the concept of innovation, it was only a very recent invention to connect innovation with technology. In first instance, it had primarily a political meaning. So, for instance, if you are Luther and you start the Reformation, then the Roman Catholic Church blames him to be an innovator. And then, of course, the logical response is to say, no, we are not the innovators. The Roman Catholics, they were the innovators because they invented the Pope, which is not in the Bible. And so that is interesting to see that innovation as a technical concept is, let's say, emerging in the 70s. As an economic term, it emerges with the work of Joseph Schumpeter, one of the most important theorists on economics in connection with innovation. And that is what I take as an inspiration to open up the notion of innovation, not only away from the output, the artifact, but to the process, but then to look at this process not only from an economic perspective or a technical perspective as technical evolution, but as an evolution that concerns both this artifact, but also the social political domain, and also the epistemological or the ontological domain.
It's really interesting, and in fact, you reference to Schumpeter, the economist, because obviously he got a concept of creative destruction, and your actual concept is war of creation. Yeah. So so at some point, obviously, they are, in my opinion, they are quite linked to these two ideas. But if you can maybe comment on these two, in principle, looking opposing ideas.
Yeah. You can. What I really like Schumpeter's work, and indeed his notion of creative destruction, because it already introduces a level of analysis beyond a particular business or a particular artifact. And so, for instance, he provides the example of the invention of steam engine. So, the notion of creative destruction means innovation creates not only a new product like steam engines, but it changes the rules of the game. For instance, if we have trains running on steam, then we can grow the amount of railway industries based on steam, and suddenly someone invents the diesel engine. And on the one hand, the diesel engine is just a new artifact, but according to Schumpeter, it creates also a new market and it destructs the existing market. So the existing market of steam-driven railway industries is replaced. And that is, I think, good to also to understand if we talk about technology and technological innovations, that the creative part, the emergence of something new, goes hand in hand with the destruction of the old order. And that is for Schumpeter primarily an economic order, but you can relatively easily extend this to other orders. To give an example, if we have the invention of the steam engine and we have a steam-driven economy, like in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it enables to transport enormous amounts of resources from the countryside to city centers, but also workforces that are needed to build these city centers, to build the factories. And according to science and technology scholars and history of technology scholars, it is not only the case that the steam engine is a new artifact that fuels the Industrial Revolution, but you can also say that social dimensions like urbanization, the emergence of a working class, the reduction of the status of the nobility are all kinds of social effects, one could argue, based on technological innovations that are changing the rules of the game, not only in the economic sense, but also in the social political sense. And that is why I believe that creative destruction is an important notion, also because we tend to be very positive about technology, but with the notion of destruction, we have also an ability to say something about the dark side of the moon, so to speak.
Sure. And in the regards to this temporal dimension, process of emergence, and the creative destruction, and the work of making from the work of creation, from the innovation, which for the thinking about startups, founders, innovators, policymakers, or practitioners who might be listening, what would you say is the main shift in mindset that an ontology of creation invites or demands for them to embrace this approach?
So I can say a few things about this, because the interesting thing, of course, is that according to Schumpeter, again, if you allow me, because that's the fun part of an economist in this case, Schumpeter argues there is a tendency towards power concentration by big corporates. And I think that this is also something that we experience today, namely how big tech in the digital world, so we're not talking about the steam engine anymore, but if we talk about the current age in which we say that not steam is determining everything, but digitalization is determining the social political domain, then we have a problem, or some people experience a problem with the role of particular companies which have a very strong power concentration and can defend also their power. And the interesting thing here is that Schumpeter would say the only remedy to do this is capitalism. So capitalism is the way that always the power of existing big corporates will be broken, because there will always be new entrants in the market who will change the rule of the game. So the process of creative destruction is a solution for the dark side of capitalism, namely the tendency towards power concentration. And I think that the startups that you are talking about do experience problems with, if they are in the field of digital technology, for instance, to what extent is there still an open space for new entrants, for instance, in the market? And on the one hand, then, based on Schumpeter, you can say, don't worry too much, because this is the rule, or this is the way capitalism works. It will be creatively destructed like it was before. So all big corporates will one day or another will die. And that's also one of the things that, from an economic perspective, there are almost no companies that are older than 100 years. And that is then, let's say, sometimes used as an argument for this. You can also, of course, be more critical and say, yeah, but maybe the current situation is a little bit different because it's even impossible to creative destruct as long as the Apples, the Amazons, and the Metas are in charge. And that is why some people are very critical. I tend to say that although, of course, I'm not an economist, on the one hand, from an evolutionary temporal perspective, it is indeed the case that technologies will be created, but also one day will be destructed. And what we can take this as an invitation to experiment with new emerging things, and also startups can do that. And for instance, I work a lot with biomimicry, for instance. So how can technologies mimic natural principles, and can they inform a new type of business? So then you are a little bit more positive. If you are more concerned about the power of big tech, for instance, one of the things that I've been thinking of is to rehabilitate a political concept of innovation. So if we, what I referred to before, if we accept that innovation is not primarily or not only an economic term, but also a political concept, then we have to think about how can we rehabilitate the political orientation of innovation again. For instance, asking to what extent innovations contribute to the public sphere. And then you can be relatively critical towards current big tech companies because they privatize everything. And you can say there are opportunities for responsible startup, green startups, as soon as we start to reconsider the economic sphere, the dominance of the economic sphere within a public sphere or political sphere.
Yeah, you connected obviously the response, the innovation also, in fact, from the policy perspective, with the included also for business, I believe, with responsible business, ethics, business, etc., which is also a key aspect in your research and your publications. And as we go now approaching the end of our time, I would like to just simply remind you to the key points you have highlighted, this temporal dimension, the powers of emergence, the creative destruction from the Schumpeter. Among all of these ideas, if you could leave listeners with one key idea about innovation and creation, and that's something that often gets overlooked or in our current narratives, or that but you consider essential, what this idea would be.
Yeah. Yeah, so one thing that I think is important and maybe not really mentioned till now is that also policymakers, we have a tendency to set the human and human creativity in the center of our innovation policies and economic policies. So the human is the primary agent, the human as the inventor. And the truth is, this is just not the case. So many innovations were the product of coincidence. Think of the invention of glass, for instance. It was a pure coincidence. It is much more an evolutionary process in which there is co-constitution built on environment. So, for instance, you will never invent the train in the high mountains, so to speak. You need a relatively flat ecosystem in which it makes sense to develop such an. And I would say that that doesn't mean that the human is not relevant, that he's just the object of innovation. There is a co-constitutive role of the human as co-creator and as experimenter and all that kind of thing. So that's not, I don't want to have a deep determinist idea of technology. But what I think that is maybe important for also policymakers, but also startups, to have a more ecosystem type of perspective on innovation, and what you find important, this temporal dimension, that that we can maybe less or not only steer precisely on the technology, but steer and the environment that affords certain technologies or innovations that harnesses against some innovation trajectories, because there are all kinds of path dependencies in the history of technology that we can take as an example. So I think moving from a tech focus to an ecosystem focus, and to this temporality of emergence, in which the natural environment is also co-constitutive for our technologies. The human is co-constitutive, but also the knowledge base that we have, like the universities that we have. And that would be, in my view, something that could be considered and taken serious more, in a more straightforward way, I guess.
Well, this is really interesting, this embeddedness of the ecosystem and the temporal dimension for the innovation. Take as a main key idea. And Vincent, thank you very much for this rich and generous conversation. It has been a pleasure to explore with you how innovation, time, and creation come together at the level of world formation. And for those who want to dig deeper in Vincent's work, we will share also links to his books and articles alongside this conversation. Thank you again, and I hope this is the first of many more dialogues. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.